My beloved of Canada, pause for a moment and place your full attention here. What God has appointed across August 23rd, August 24th, and August 25th will not unfold as one obvious event. And these are not three isolated dates in this message. They form one sequence. And the greatest danger is not that nothing happens, but that you expect the wrong kind of sign and walk past the first movement because it looks too quiet. What begins on the 23rd will not be understood correctly until you see why the 24th and 25th must follow it. An algorithm may have placed these words on your screen, but your attention made a decision when it stopped here. This is not decorative language built around an ordinary weekend. The 23rd carries one function, the 24th carries another, and the 25th closes a process that neither of the first two can finish alone. I will not give you the full sequence yet because the condition in which you enter these days matters as much as the days themselves. Over the last 72 hours, some of you who walk on Canadian soil have felt a change that is difficult to explain. You may have wanted more quiet, ended a conversation sooner than usual, or looked at a message and felt no need to answer immediately. You may have been surrounded by people while some deeper part of you remained alert and observant. That shift in attention matters, because before a watchman recognizes movement on the horizon, the watchman first learns how to become still enough to see. Across this vast land, from the Atlantic to the Pacific, some of you have also been waking in the deep hours, often somewhere between 3 and 4, with a strange alertness in the middle of the silence. You may remember only a face, a doorway, a number, a sentence, or the feeling that something unfinished followed you back into waking. Then morning comes, and the weight in your body feels deeper than ordinary tiredness. Do not rush to explain it yet, because the first clue is hidden in what these experiences are changing about your attention. My chosen ones of the true north, you have spent a long season interpreting silence as absence. You prayed, waited, kept showing up, and there were stretches when nothing outside you seemed to confirm what you carried inside. That can make even a strong spiritual warrior wonder whether the delay means something went wrong. But what if the stillness was not empty? And what if it was training you to recognize a quieter form of instruction before these 3 days arrive? This is where the identity of the watchman becomes important. A watchman does not make the sunrise happen and does not control what is approaching. The assignment is to remain awake enough to recognize movement before everyone else sees it, to guard what has been entrusted, and to respond at the right time. That is the spirit of Shamar in this message. You may have called some of your separation emptiness, when part of it was training you to stand watch. So carry this first question with you. Why would 3 consecutive days need to function as one movement if everything were meant to arrive all at once? The answer is connected to preparation, recognition, and response. And if one of those is missing, a door can stand open while the person in front of it still does not know what to do. That is why I do not want you staring at the calendar with fear. I want you watching the order. That same principle will matter on August 23rd. Do not expect the first day to carry the whole answer. The opening movement may look more like clearing than arrival, more like clarity than celebration, or more like a boundary becoming obvious than a reward appearing in your hands. Children of the maple leaf, many people become confused here because they expect every movement from heaven to feel immediately like increase, when sometimes increase begins by showing you what cannot continue. You may notice this first in a relationship or conversation. Someone may say something ordinary, yet you hear the pattern beneath the words more clearly than before, and the old urge to defend or over-explain does not rise with the same force. You do not need to create conflict or make an announcement. The sign is not drama. The sign is that your inner agreement with an old pattern is weakening. You expected pressure before a turning point, but instead you may feel detached from things that once controlled your reactions. That quiet does not automatically mean movement has stopped. It may mean your attention is being cleared so you can hear the next instruction without interference. Watch what has been falling away without a fight, because that is the second clue, and it will matter when the calendar reaches the 23rd. There is a reason Scripture speaks about vision having an appointed time. The principle is not frantic prediction, but the meeting of timing and readiness. A promise can have a season while the person carrying it still needs discernment to recognize what that season is asking for. That is why these 3 days are useless if they only make you excited. They must make you attentive. Anointed One of Canada, you who dwell from the Rockies to the shores of Newfoundland, there is another layer here that is more uncomfortable. Not every open door should be entered simply because it opens quickly, and not every returning person belongs in the next chapter simply because the words sound better this time. Not every sudden offer deserves your yes simply because it arrives near a moment you have been calling breakthrough. One of the central questions of August 23rd, 24th, and 25th is not only what opens, but what may arrive wearing the appearance of what you have been waiting for. Hold that thought without trying to solve it too early. The most convincing imitation will not present itself as something obviously destructive. It will look close enough to an old desire that an impatient version of you would accept it before asking what it costs your peace. It will make speed feel like confirmation and pressure feel like purpose. But the true door will not require you to abandon the discernment that this long season has built inside you. This is why the weight you have carried and the distance you have felt from noise do not automatically mean you are falling behind. Some of that season has forced you to slow your reactions and observe longer. And in the process, you began seeing patterns you once excused. You were learning the difference between peace and emotional shutdown, between a clean boundary and a reaction, between an invitation that brings clarity and one that only activates an old wound. That distinction will become critical on August 24th. The spiritual warrior in you has been learning that strength is not always loud. Sometimes, strength is a delayed answer, a decision allowed to mature, or the willingness to let someone misunderstand your silence while you protect the clarity forming inside you. You were trained by the world to associate power with immediate action. This season has been teaching you the authority of accurate timing. Canada, my chosen nation of the North, watch what happens just before the window opens. Something familiar may try to regain your attention through an old obligation, an old emotional pull, or a request that arrives with unusual urgency. Do not label it too quickly. Simply notice whether engaging with it makes you clearer or more scattered, more settled, or more desperate to act. Because the middle day of this sequence will test that distinction more deeply than the first. Many of you across Canada have spent years being the person who senses the room before anyone speaks. You notice when the atmosphere changes, when the words sound correct but the intention feels different, and when a conversation turns before anyone acknowledges it. For a long time, that sensitivity made you question yourself because other people did not always confirm what you noticed. The assignment now, my chosen ones of the true North, is not to become suspicious of everyone. It is to become honest about what your discernment has repeatedly shown you. Here is the next piece I want you to keep close. What unfolds across August 23rd, 24th, and 25th is not built around one dramatic external event that must look identical for everyone. The 3 stages can express themselves differently in different lives, which is why copying a sign carried by another person would only create more confusion. One person may receive clarity about a relationship, another about a stalled opportunity, another about a pattern that has followed the family for years. But the deeper movement will carry the same signature of increasing clarity. This is why the first sign can be missed so easily. People expect heaven to announce transition with volume, but some transitions begin when an old appetite loses its power. You hear the old trigger and it no longer commands the same reaction. Or you look at the old door and realize you no longer need it to open. The first stage is not trying to impress you. It is revealing what has already started losing its grip. And once you recognize what has lost its grip, space opens for the more serious question. What deserves your yes? When 2 doors appear to carry the same promise, the false door may use the vocabulary of an old desire and may seem to solve the pressure that made you weary. But if it requires you to rush past discernment, betray a boundary, or become the old version of yourself to keep it, appearance alone cannot be your evidence. For now, beloved sons and daughters of Canada, let this first truth settle. You are not entering August 23rd, 24th, and 25th as someone waiting helplessly for something to happen to you. You are entering as a watchman, an anointed one, and a spiritual warrior who has been trained by silence to recognize patterns that noise once hid from you. The 3 days are connected, but your first instruction is simple. Do not rush to interpret what appears. Notice what becomes clear, and keep one question alive as we move forward. If the first day only opens the first lock, and the final day closes a process that began before you could see the whole picture, what happens in the middle that makes August 24th the hinge of the entire sequence? We cannot answer that until we look more closely at the signs your spirit, your attention, and your recent nights have been carrying. Once that pattern is visible, you will understand why the brightest looking door is not always the door you were prepared to enter. Chosen one, you who walk beneath the northern lights and across the Canadian prairies, the first thing you need to understand is that the signs you have been noticing do not all mean what you first assumed they meant. The heaviness in your body, the need for silence, the sudden loss of interest in conversations that once pulled you in, and the strange alertness that comes before dawn can all look like proof that something is wrong. But in this message, they point in another direction. What looks like depletion can also be the moment your attention stops feeding what no longer belongs in the next season. A watchman learns this distinction before anything else. The body can be tired while the spirit becomes more precise, and the room can be loud while something inside you becomes unusually still. You may have noticed that you are speaking less but seeing more, explaining less but recognizing patterns faster. That is not a command to distrust everyone around you. It is an invitation to notice whether your inner world is becoming quieter enough to separate signal from noise. Some of you across this vast land woke between 3 and 4 in the morning and did not know why your eyes opened. You did not need a dramatic dream for the moment to stay with you.
Maybe there was only a name in your mind, a place you have not thought about for months, a number you have been seeing repeatedly, or a feeling that one chapter is reaching its limit. The unusual part is not simply that you woke up. The unusual part is what your attention keeps returning to after the moment has passed. This is the first micro-sign I want you to hold. A spiritual warrior often expects preparation to feel powerful, but real preparation can feel strangely ordinary while it is happening. You clean something you have ignored, cancel something you no longer want to carry, stop checking for a reply, or decide not to reopen an old argument. Then later you realize that the small action created room for a much larger decision. The quiet action may matter more than the dramatic feeling. Now look again at August 23rd, August 24th, and August 25th. These dates sit beside one another, but they do not carry the same assignment in the structure of this message. August 23rd falls on a Sunday, August 24th on a Monday, and August 25th on a Tuesday, creating a natural movement from stillness into decision into establishment. I am not asking you to turn the calendar into superstition. I am asking you to notice the order, because the order is what gives the 3 days their meaning here. Sunday is the threshold in this sequence. It represents the clearing of noise, the ending of an old agreement, and the moment when you stop forcing an answer simply because silence makes you uncomfortable. Monday moves differently. It brings the question into ordinary life where discernment has to survive messages, work, family expectations, money decisions, and the pressure to respond quickly. Tuesday becomes the point where what you recognized must become something you can stand in without returning to the old pattern. That is why the 3 days cannot be treated as 3 separate predictions. The first without the second would leave you with awareness but no decision. The second without the first would tempt you to act before your inner world is clear. The third without both would become a declaration with no foundation beneath it. The sequence matters because clearing, discernment, and establishment are different spiritual tasks. And here is what makes the middle of this message more important than it may seem right now. The thing that determines whether you recognize what is in front of you may not be the strength of your faith alone. There is another layer connected to the condition of the receiver, to the way attention, clarity, memory, and inner recognition work together when a person is under pressure. I am going to return to that later, because there is research behind this that deserves to be explained carefully, rather than turned into a slogan. For now, children of the maple leaf,
Hold one question. What if part of what you have called spiritual fog is also connected to how well the receiver inside you is able to recognize what is already being placed in front of it?
Do not answer that question too quickly. I have not named the mechanism, and I have not given you the full explanation yet. That is deliberate, because if I gave you a solution before you understood the pattern, it would sound disconnected from everything you have lived through. First, you need to see why the watchman identity and the receiver question belong in the same conversation. The problem is that prolonged spiritual pressure can make every signal feel equally loud. A memory arrives and feels urgent. A request arrives and feels urgent. An old connection returns and feels urgent. A financial decision appears and suddenly everything inside you wants immediate relief. When every signal is treated as urgent, discernment becomes harder, which is exactly why the first movement of this 3-day sequence is clearing rather than acceleration. This is where many people misread the sign. They expect confirmation to arrive as excitement, but sometimes the first confirmation is the absence of the old compulsion. You do not feel the need to chase, defend, prove, convince, or reopen what has already shown you its pattern. The missing reaction becomes the message. And if you notice that before August 23rd, pay attention because it may be the quietest clue in the entire sequence. Canada, my chosen nation of the North, that is part of Shamar. To watch is not merely to look outward for an enemy. It is also to guard what has become sacred inside you. Your peace, your attention, your ability to hear clearly, your willingness to wait one more hour before answering a pressured request. These are not small things. They form the interior gate through which every future yes and every future no must pass. And this is the second microsign. Notice what happens when you delay a response that once would have been automatic. If your inner world becomes clearer as the pressure fades, that tells you something about the source of the urgency. If clarity grows when you become still, do not ignore that change. The truest door in this sequence will not need confusion to keep you moving toward it. August 23rd, therefore, begins with less spectacle than many people expect. It may bring a realization, a quiet release, an unexpected change in your desire, or the sudden ability to see an old pattern without defending it. For one person, it may concern a relationship. For another, it may concern a work decision, a conversation in the family, or a responsibility that has been carried too long. The surface can differ, while the deeper function remains the same. August 24th is where that cleared space meets pressure. Something may ask for an answer, a choice, a boundary, a commitment, or a refusal to return to what no longer fits. This is why the middle day is the hinge. But I am still not giving you the full reason yet. The important thing now is to understand that the pressure itself is not proof that the opportunity is correct. Somewhere in your recent days, there may already be a missing signal.
Not something new that appeared, but something old that stopped controlling you. A person did not respond, and you remained steady. A plan changed, and you did not collapse into frantic interpretation. Someone tried to draw you into an old role, and you noticed the pattern before stepping back into it. What disappeared from your reaction may be more important than what appeared in your circumstances. Chosen one of Canada, you who dwell from the Great Lakes to the boreal forest, do not fill that space too quickly. A cycle breaker often becomes uncomfortable when there is finally peace, because the family pattern trained everyone to treat tension as normal. When conflict disappears, the old habit can go looking for another problem to solve. But the new assignment is different. It asks whether you can remain in stillness long enough for a cleaner instruction to form. This is why I want you to remember the phrase receiver condition, without turning it into a technical explanation yet. Later in this message, I will show you why clarity can be affected by more than desire, sincerity, or spiritual hunger. There is a reason some people pray with conviction and still describe feeling mentally scattered, while others enter a quiet state and suddenly recognize the next step with unusual precision. The answer will connect something deeply spiritual with something surprisingly physical. Before we go further, notice how the pieces are beginning to align. The early waking, the desire for quiet, the reduced need to explain yourself.
The old reaction, losing strength, and the growing sensitivity to pressure are not five separate messages in this framework. They form one preparation pattern. The watchman is not being made more fearful. The watchman is being made more precise. So when August 23rd arrives, do not spend the day hunting for spectacle. Watch what becomes simpler. Watch what no longer deserves an argument. Watch which obligation suddenly reveals its real weight. And watch whether a familiar voice tries to pull you back into urgency, just as your inner world becomes clearer. The first lock does not open with noise. It opens when you can finally tell the difference between what demands your attention and what actually deserves it. Then carry one final question into the next movement. If your spirit has been sensing correctly, but the receiver has been carrying too much noise to organize what it senses, what would change if that receiver could return to a clearer condition at the exact moment a decision appears? That question is not being answered here. It is being protected, because once the answer is opened, the entire meaning of the middle day changes. And that is where we are going next. We have identified the symptoms, the sequence, the missing reaction, and the hidden question underneath the calendar. Now we have to reframe what you thought the long delay meant.
Because if you keep reading preparation as punishment, you will misread the very process that made you ready to recognize the door. My beloved of Canada, what if you have been reading the evidence backwards? What if the quiet season you called delay was not proof that the promise moved farther away, but proof that your old way of recognizing direction could no longer carry you into what comes next? You kept looking outside for movement while something more important was being rearranged inside your attention. And that is why the last season may have felt slower at the exact moment you were becoming more prepared. For a long time, you measured progress by visible confirmation. A conversation had to change, a door had to open, someone had to recognize your value, money had to move, circumstances had to shift, or an answer had to arrive in a form you could immediately name. When those things did not happen, part of you assumed nothing was happening at all. But a watchman cannot depend only on visible movement. A watchman is trained to recognize the difference between absence and preparation. Across this vast land from coast to coast, there are seasons when the most important change is not what enters your life, but what loses authority over your decisions. That is the reframe you need before August 23rd, because otherwise you may mistake clearing for disappointment. Think about what has already changed. There was a time when one unanswered message could occupy your mind for hours. One strange tone in someone's voice could make you replay an entire conversation. One delayed opportunity could send you searching for signs that you had made a mistake. But lately, even if the old reaction still visits, it does not always stay as long. That matters more than you realize. The old version of you needed external movement before inner peace could return. The version being formed now is learning to keep clarity even before circumstances explain themselves. And once that begins, delay stops functioning as punishment and starts revealing what it was teaching you. This is where I want to return to a question I asked you to hold earlier. What if part of what you have called spiritual fog is connected to the condition of the receiver itself? I have not forgotten that question, and I am not closing it yet. In fact, what comes next will make that question more important, because the answer is not simply spiritual, and it is not simply physical. Before we reach that bridge, you need to understand why the question matters. Imagine two people standing in front of the same opportunity. Both have prayed. Both believe they are ready. Both see the same facts. Yet one notices the hidden pressure inside the offer, while the other notices only the relief it seems to promise. The difference is not always courage. It is not always intelligence. It is not always who loves God more. Sometimes the difference is whether a person can remain clear enough under pressure to notice the pattern beneath the appearance. That is why discernment is not only about receiving more information, it is also about what happens inside you when information arrives. Children of the true north, this changes the way you read the last months. You may have thought heaven was withholding answers when some of the season was teaching you not to answer everything immediately. You may have thought you were being forgotten when your dependence on constant reassurance was slowly being exposed. You may have called the silence rejection when it was forcing you to hear how often fear had been speaking in the voice of urgency.
That does not mean every delay is sacred. It does not mean every closed door carries a hidden message. It means you do not have to interpret every pause as evidence against yourself. Sometimes the most useful question is not, "Why has nothing happened?" but, "What can I see now that I could not see when I was desperate for something to happen?" That question is going to protect you on August 23rd. The first day in the sequence is easy to misunderstand because people naturally expect a prophetic date to announce itself with something dramatic. They expect an obvious message, an unexpected call, a sudden financial change, or an event so unusual that no interpretation is required. But the first movement may be almost the opposite. My beloved sons and daughters of Canada, the most important thing that happens on the 23rd may be something you do not do. You do not reply from irritation. You do not reopen the door because loneliness appeared for 1 hour. You do not accept an offer simply because it solves an immediate discomfort. You do not explain yourself to someone who has already decided how they want to misunderstand you. That is the day 23 misdirection. You may be looking for arrival, while the real movement is separation. You may be waiting for addition, while the first evidence is subtraction. And if that happens, do not conclude that the sequence failed. Clearing is part of the sequence. There is a biblical pattern behind this that we will examine more carefully. Again and again, preparation and visible appointment are not the same moment. David could be anointed before the throne became visible. Moses could carry an assignment before he understood how the road would unfold. Elijah could reach a place of exhaustion without that exhaustion becoming the final definition of his calling. The pattern matters because identity often arrives before circumstance catches up. A person can be prepared for a responsibility long before the environment recognizes
Something has changed if you can hear pressure without automatically obeying it. Something has changed if you can feel disappointment without turning it into a verdict about your future. Something has changed if a person can return with familiar words and you still take time to observe whether the pattern beneath those words is different. Chosen one of Canada, you who stand firm on Canadian soil, this is where your identity as an anointed one becomes practical rather than decorative. Anointing is not permission to call every desire divine. It demands greater responsibility for what you agree with. The more important the next season becomes, the less you can afford to confuse intensity with instruction. And here is the part many people miss entirely. The counterfeit does not need to look evil. If it looked obviously destructive, discernment would require almost nothing. The more difficult test is something that resembles an answered prayer closely enough to awaken the version of you that is tired of waiting. Imagine an old connection returning with better language, but the same pressure. Imagine an opportunity that promises speed, but immediately demands that you violate a boundary you worked hard to establish. Imagine an invitation that sounds like recognition, but requires you to become smaller in order to keep it. The appearance can be attractive, while the internal pattern remains familiar. This is why August 23rd is not simply about what opens. It is about what becomes visible once urgency loses control of your interpretation. When the old emotional pressure becomes quieter, details appear that were always present but difficult to notice. The wording, the timing, the way your body becomes tense when you imagine saying yes, the way your thoughts become scattered when you start bargaining with what you already know. Do not turn those observations into fear. Use them as information. A watchman does not panic at every movement on the horizon. A watchman watches long enough to identify what kind of movement it is. That patience is part of the authority you are being asked to carry. Now we reach the retention point I warned you about. There is one mistake powerful, spiritually sensitive people make when the waiting season finally begins to change. They assume that because they survived the delay, they are now immune to rushing. But the end of a long wait can make a person more vulnerable to the wrong door, not less, because relief itself can become persuasive. Think about that carefully, my chosen ones of the true north. When you have been thirsty for a long time, the first water offered can feel like the right water. When you have felt unseen for a long time, the first strong recognition can feel like destiny. When you have carried financial pressure for months,
The first fast opportunity can feel like provision before you have examined its cost. That is why the real test may not come during the empty season. It may come when something finally appears.
The question becomes whether you can remain the same discerning person when the thing in front of you looks like the answer you wanted. This is also why your recent calm matters. The silence has been teaching you how your inner world feels when it is not being pulled in 5 directions. You are learning the texture of clarity. Once you know that texture, you can recognize when an opportunity requires you to abandon it. And this brings us back to the receiver question again. If discernment depends partly on your ability to remain clear when information arrives, then understanding the condition of attention becomes more important than simply collecting more signs. Across this vast land from coast to coast, you are not being asked to become more suspicious. You are being asked to become less automatic. You are not being asked to fear August 23rd. You are being asked to enter it without forcing the day to perform for you. If the first movement is clearing, let it clear. If a conversation reveals its old pattern, observe it without turning the moment into a battle. If an obligation suddenly feels heavier because you can finally see what it has been costing you, notice that the watchman does not need to create a sign when the sign is already the change in perception. Then comes August 24th, and this is where the pressure increases. The middle day is not important because the calendar itself has magical power. It is important within this sequence because this is the point where awareness has to become discernment under real conditions. Something understood in silence must survive contact with ordinary life. A decision made while everything is calm can feel simple. A decision made when someone is disappointed, when money is involved, when old affection returns, or when an opportunity has a deadline, feels different. That is why the hinge is not merely about receiving information. It is about whether clarity remains clarity when something valuable appears to be at stake. Children of the maple leaf, the old version of spiritual sensitivity, needed every unusual event to mean something immediately. The watchman can notice, record, wait, compare, and remain open. The spiritual warrior does not lose power by checking the pattern. The spiritual warrior becomes harder to manipulate. And that is exactly why the counterfeit warning belongs in this sequence. The wrong door does not need your ignorance. It only needs your impatience. If it can make you act before the full pattern becomes visible, it does not need to deceive you forever. It only needs one premature yes. August 23rd, therefore, becomes a test of clearing. August 24th becomes a test of discernment under pressure. August 25th will establish what survives the hinge. For now, remember the one sentence that changes the way you read everything behind you. The delay did not automatically mean you were denied. The silence did not automatically mean you were abandoned. And the lack of visible movement did not automatically mean nothing was being prepared. Canada, my chosen nation of the North, you have been learning how not to surrender your clarity the moment something attractive appears. You have been learning how to remain still when urgency tries to make the decision for you. You have been learning how to recognize the difference between a door that honors the person you have become and a door that only rewards the person you used to be. Hold that distinction as we move into the appointed days. My beloved of Canada, if this message has spoken to your spirit and brought clarity to your path, subscribe to this channel now so you never miss a prophetic word from Archangel Michael. Share this message across this vast land with every Canadian who is seeking divine discernment in this hour.